This is the story of burnt oak told in maps and pictures from the local studies collection of the London Borough of Barnet. How the area developed over 100 years from the 1860s to the 1960s, from the time of farms and the infamous Red Hill Workhouse through public transport into the burnt oak we see today with housing estates and shopping parades. In the 1860s, most of the area we now call burnt oak was open fields and farms. This part of Middlesex produced some of the best hay in England, and for centuries workers would come during the late spring and early summer to make the hay. Most of the land east of the Edgware Road belonged to Goldbeater's farm, which was 1.5 kilometres to the east in Mill Hill. Established in the 14th century, by the 19th century it was owned by the Marshall family and was over 300 acres of hayfields. On the morning of May Day, the first mown hay was brought through the western gate on carts decked in gay ribbons and coloured rosettes to the bald-faced stag on the Edgware Road. Here, farmers from miles around would meet with their own gaily decorated carts, and after breakfast they formed a procession down the road to London's Haymarket at Cumberland Square. Not all the land belonged to Goldbeaters. During the 19th century, the 33 acres of Sheaves Hill Common Field was rented out in strips to some 46 tenants. Although the field name was known in Tudor times, it was a much older medieval system of strip farming that provided land to peasants, a rare survival for Middlesex that was just about to become extinct. The strips are not shown in the Ordnance Survey of the 1890s. The only other private house east of the Silk Stream was Orange Hill House. In the 18th century, it was just another field, which was possibly named to celebrate the accession of William III in 1688. There was a house by 1811, but the Orange Hill House we know today was built for Mr. Ruddock in 1881. West of the Edgware Road were Burnt Oak Farm and Red Hill Farm. Burnt Oak Farmhouse was new at the time of this map, having been built in the 1840s. Red Hill Farm had its origins in the 17th century windmill that was a farm by the 18th century. Both farms produced hay, but they were also stud farms and livery stables where horses were bred and kept for people living in London. This building, on the site of what is now Red Hill Court, is Hendon Union Workhouse, opened in 1840. The Hendon Union included a number of parishes in northwest Middlesex. Burnt Oak was some distance from the parish centres, and it was enough to remove the embarrassment of poverty felt by middle-class parishioners. The poor of the surrounding parishes, too old or too feeble, or simply unable to find work, were sent to the new house. Under the control of the first chair of the Board of Guardians, the Vicar of Hendon, Reverend Theodore Williams, the institution gained a reputation for cruelty. A notice in Latin that Williams had placed in the entry hall promised benevolent justice, but Hendon's workhouse punishments were the severest allowed by law. Inmates were not allowed out, and those who broke one of the many rules faced solitary confinement, a bread and water diet, and the straitjacket. Such treatment occasionally led to the death of inmates. At the time of this map, 1863, there were about 130 inmates. Women and men and children were all accommodated separately and were not allowed to mix. A workhouse school for the children was built in 1860, and a Mr. Edward Hunwick was employed as the first master. Hunwick started a boys' band at the school, which was so successful that it was in much demand in the local area for fetes and shows during the 19th century. The Union School continued until the early 1920s, and nothing remains of the school building except this war memorial. When in 1883 the building was extended, Edward Hunwick was promoted to master of the house. He was a capable and kind-hearted officer in whose hands the poor fairer treatment than they had under Williams. When Hunwick retired in 1893, there were 342 inmates. The workhouse infirmary was built in 1863, but by the early 20th century it was clear that it was too small for the district's growing population. In the 20th century, under the leadership of the Union's medical officer, Dr. Alexander Finlater, a new hospital was built on land behind the Union School and opened in 1927 as Red Hill Hospital. Comparing the 1863 map with the same sheet from 1895, we can see Burnt Oak has become the district name. Between the Union Workhouse and school were North Road, South Road and East Road, laid out in 1853 by the Middlesex Freehold Land Society on what had been Burnt Oak Field. The plan was to encourage home ownership among people of modest means, which in turn would allow the new owners to vote. In the first half of the 19th century, the area was known as Red Hill, and the workhouse was commonly known as Red Hill Workhouse. With such a bad reputation, the Freehold Society often referred to the district as Burnt Oak. The name Burnt Oak came from a large veteran oak, which had stood some time before the 1750s at the meeting point of three local parishes. It caught fire, a consequence of being struck by lightning, and when it finally rotted away, a stone marker was put up by Kingsbury Parish, marking the spot where it had once stood. Between 1853 and this map in 1863, there was very little house building in Burnt Oak. There were 3 beer houses catering for travellers and Londoners seeking a day out in the country. The Load of Hay, close to the junction of Bacon Lane, opened by 1851, and 2 on the Freehold Estate. The Royal Oak, opened by 1862, and the Prince of Wales, opened by 1869, and even a couple of shops, but little else. The area's association with Hendon Workhouse was not the only problem for developers. At the junction of Deansbrook Lane and the Edgware Road was the Edgware Tollgate. In the 1860s, wagons paid 4p halfpenny, and riders on horseback were charged 3p halfpenny to use the road. With removal of the tollgate in 1872 and the new district name of Burnt Oak, house builders gained confidence, and by the mid-1880s there were about 100 houses, most of which were on the Middlesex Freehold Estate. In October 1884, there was even a school for 28 children opened on East Road, which doubled on Sundays as an Anglican church. It is a measure of the district's growth that the school was replaced with a new school in North Road for 300 children in 1901. But the Burnt Oak we know today would only happen with the arrival of mass public transport in the 20th century. In 1904, the Metropolitan Electric Tramways started a tram service between Cricklewood and Edgware, with stops in Burnt Oak. In 1913, a plan to extend the tube from Golders Green to Edgware with a station at Burnt Oak was announced. But the Great War held the project up and work did not start until the early 1920s. The station was built away from the Edgware Road in a field at the junction of Burnt Oak Brook and the Silk Stream. A bridge had to be constructed over the railway, and tunnels had to be made for the 2 brooks. The station was opened in August 1924, with the building designed by architect Stanley Heaps completed in 1925. The London Electric Railway Company wanted the new station to be called Sheaves Hill, but by the 1920s few locals could remember the medieval fields, and Hendon Council suggested that the company should consider Goldbeaters and Orange Hill as station names. Eventually, Burnt Oak was chosen. On the other side of the bridge was the first remote-controlled and automatically operated substation in the country. Inside 2 1,200 kilowatt transformers and rotary equipment turned a raw 11,000 volts of power into suitable power for the conductor rails used by the trains. It enabled the line to be carried so far into the countryside, but be controlled remotely at Golders Green, nearly 4 miles away. With good transport links, the process of suburbanization was inevitable. The farmland west of the Edgware Road were slowly built over between the two world wars. First to go were part of Burnt Oak Farm, starting in 1919 with the Canada Park Estate, which had two new roads, Vancouver Road and Columbia Avenue. South of Canada Park was the Highlands Estate, with its cul-de-sacs with quaint Scottish place names like Kenmore, Argyll and Strathmore Gardens, built from 1927, the last building being the curious attempt at Scott's baronial Moorcroft of 1933. Red Hill Farm, which had been the home to Bertram Mill circus horses before the Great War, was built over by 1927. Not even Stag Lane Aerodrome, where the great Amy Johnson learned to fly, could hold out against the developers and made way for suburban houses in 1936. The de Havilland Aircraft Factory becoming an industrial island in a sea of semi-detached houses. No history of Burnt Oak would be complete without the Watling Estate. In December 1924, shortly after the completion of the railway line, the London County Council announced their intention to build a large housing estate west of the Edgware Road on Golbeater's Farm at Cheeves Hill. They needed new houses because in London's Islington and St Pancras districts there were 120,000 people living in overcrowded conditions. For the men returning from the Great War, here would be 3,698 cottage houses with gardens and clean air and proper homes for heroes. Unlike the development of the western side of the Edgware Road, the Watling Estate was a planned new town, with land put aside for churches, schools, parks, and even a row of shops in Deansbrook Road. The plan utilised many of the mature trees which had provided the field boundaries and allowed the Burnt Oak Brook to run above ground to form as a special feature. The residents could choose from 3 different styles of houses, made of brick, wood and steel, and there were also to be 320 flats. In the end, they acquired 390 acres of what had been Golbeater's Farm, and by the end of the 1920s, the old Orange Hill house found itself surrounded by cottages. The first of the 20,000 residents moved in during 1927. Not everyone in the surrounding districts of Mill Hill and Edgware were happy with the arrival of so many working-class Londoners on their doorstep. It was believed that the children from the estate would commit crimes and that their parents supported dangerous revolutionary politics. Some even nicknamed the Watling Estate Little Moscow, and some local shops refused to serve the housewives from the estate. The Watling Association was formed in 1928 by some of the estate's residents to speak up for the new community and provide a social life. In 1933, the Watling Centre was opened by the Prince of Wales. From here, all sorts of social activities were organised, such as sports clubs and dances, as well as special one-off events like this Christmas party for the children of the unemployed, held at the Methodist Church Hall. Every summer, from 1929 onwards, there was Watling Week, with sports and social events and a parade with bands and floats around the estate. Burnt Oak Broadway and Watling Avenue form an important shopping district of North London, built in the 1920s and 1930s. 3 years passed between the opening of the Burnt Oak Station in 1924 and the laying of the foundations of the first shopping parades in 1927. But it was 10 years before the shopping district was completed, when the London Cooperative Society opened a department store in 1936. By this time, 3 of the public houses had been rebuilt. There were 2 new cinemas, and at the northern end of the road boasted a fine new Territorial Army Centre for anti-aircraft gun units. It was opened in December 1937. The Edgware Road in Burnt Oak had been called the High Road since the 19th century, but with all the new facilities, Hendon Council decided that it should be renamed Burnt Oak Broadway in January 1936. Watling Avenue was an entirely new road, originally built to bring materials from the high road to the railway line in 1923. The new road dipped considerably from the high road, and it was necessary to bring 45,000 tonnes of earth from excavations elsewhere on the railway to level the road up. As with Burnt Oak Station, there was some discussion as to what the name of the new road should be. Until 1927, it was called Mill Hill Avenue. Burnt Oak's population quickly outgrew the shops available, and until the 1930s there were not enough shops. Watling Estate residents came from districts with inexpensive street markets, and a few enterprising residents sold goods from barrows on the Watling Avenue until Hendon Council opened Watling Market in December 1960. Over a period of 100 years, Burnt Oak grew from a now forgotten rural district of Middlesex into a suburb of London, fondly remembered. To end, let's see how many shops in Watling Avenue you recognise from this list of 50 years ago.